I'm very honored to share this work with you, and the title being Visibility, the New Value Proposition in Healthcare. So let me get started about really what I'm talking about is patient safety. I had the honor of speaking at Homecoming this week at Western. I had to do the math at how many years ago I spent time there, and it's too many to admit to. But over those 35 years as a nurse, patient safety has been the single most challenging issue every provider faces. As a nurse staring at the families' faces and their loved ones, in my case it was critically ill children, I can't tell you how many sleepless nights we have as clinicians when error happens that is just very difficult to prevent. So part of the basis for this study was to figure out how do we change the game in patient safety, how do we create clinical environments where it is just impossible, perhaps, for those errors to occur. What am I talking about in terms of errors? The spine surgeon who was using little tiny screws to actually insert rods for laminectomy patients with severe back pain, only to have them come back 18 months later because those screws were not approved and the screws were rusting. They had to be removed. There's about 4,000 patients, we think, that have those screws, but we actually don't know who they are because we track and trace almost nothing in healthcare. Canada's distinction, dubious distinction, as being a country with the highest, one of the highest rates of foreign bodies being left in surgical sites. No surgeon in the world wants to ever leave anything behind in a surgical wound, but unfortunately, despite our phenomenally highly educated clinicians and surgeons, we are among the worst in the world for that. Dialysis patients. 2 dialysis patients died in another Canadian province because the dialysate solution mixed was incorrect. It had potassium chloride in it. That stops your heart muscle from beating, instead of sodium chloride, otherwise known as salt, which is life-giving. Every one of these cases, and there are hundreds of them, is the subject of why we need to fix supply chain in healthcare systems. And when I use the term supply chain so often with my clinical colleagues, they don't necessarily know what I'm referring to. In nursing school, we don't have supply chain and logistics courses. I'm pretty sure medicine doesn't either, or any of the other clinician programs. And one of the reasons healthcare is so far behind is because we simply do not know what we don't know. So how big a problem is this and this is Canadian data? Every year, 70,000 of our patients experience a preventable serious injury. 23,000 do not survive that injury. These are deaths for reasons they never went into the hospital for. It's based on Ross Baker's research. It is the only Canadian adverse event study we've actually done. In order to know how prevalent these events are in our clinical settings, he had to go into charts, randomly select patient charts, read through by hand, and count up the type of adverse events. All by itself as a researcher, that's appalling. Especially when every other sector in the world, I can ask Cardinal Health, can you tell me what manufacturer, where this product came from, what batch number, what lot front number, what are the product attributes that you just distributed to that loading dock? They can do that in a matter of minutes. In healthcare, we haven't been able to achieve that. And far more concerning is a British Medical Journal article that now has identified medical error is our 3rd leading cause of death, right behind heart disease and cancer. That, for me, as a clinician, is unconscionable. That's the basis for this research. So is it really about clinicians? Lots of people will say, oh, Anne, if we could just get those doctors to do what they need to. It's not about getting the doctors to do what we need, or the nurses, or the other health professionals. We have to look at what environments are they actually working in, and do those environments actually support them to give the safest care possible? Ross Baker did a study that followed his 2004 work up, just released last fall. And he looked very carefully to ask the question, did we make any progress? We should have made progress. The Canadian Patient Safety Institute has been established since that 2004 study. We've had countless initiatives with safety, quality officials in our hospitals and in our clinical settings. His findings in the 2014 report found no change. So 10 years of effort and money and initiatives and research have actually revealed no outcomes. But here's some of the interesting findings I believe we need to pay attention to. 1 in 4 patients, in 1 in 4 cases, clinicians become very used to proceeding with care providers or care processes with missing clinical information. Why is that? Only 6% of Canadian hospitals actually have digital or digitized processes like medication administration. Equipment is missing or defective and not working, 1 in 3. So how is it possible you can deliver the best possible care if you don't have all the information you need and you don't have all the equipment working or available when you need it? What happens? You've got lots of patients waiting to come into your clinical settings, you make do. Sometimes you cut corners or you do the best with what you have. Clinicians generally, according to Dr. Baker, accept that reality as normal. They've probably reported it many times, but nothing's changed. Definition of insanity, keep doing what we do over and over and expecting a different result. They simply just don't keep reporting. So my suggestion in this work is there's something wrong with that clinical environment if those are some of the challenges our extremely well-educated clinicians are having to actually work within. Let's talk for a moment about adverse event reporting. One of our issues is we don't report these as frequently as they happen. Alberta are absolutely leading the charge in supply chain and adverse event reporting. They moved from manual events, they got about 1,400 events a year. As soon as they digitized, made it easier for clinicians, go online, fill in what happened, it jumped more than double, 3,400 per year. They always get 3,500 from external notice recalls, either from Health Canada, FDA, or manufacturers who are legislated to report them. 2,300 of these a year must require responses and action by our clinical settings. That's a very big number. So when we move from manual to digital and we more than double our adverse event reporting, that would suggest to me it's not about clinicians not being willing to report. It's about creating an environment where it makes it easy to report. And then we have an actual database to work from. How often are these adverse events happening? For what patient segments? In what part of our health system? I spent some time at a hospital in the US recently who showed me how they track and trace their recalls. Happens to be a recall from a company that makes syringes. I read the recall notice. The notice was, we cannot guarantee these syringes are sterile. Big problem. But the second sentence was, we've had no adverse event reports of infections. Well, of course you didn't. We don't measure what syringes are getting used for which patients, which lead to the patient outcome of an infection. We don't have a supply chain, like many other sectors, that barcode what products, what patients, what care processes, when and how did it result in value for patients. Device recalls are particularly scary. I have a close friend and colleague who's a health professional. He did all of the research on who does the best hip implant surgery. He landed in Montreal, had 2 hip replacements about 2 years apart. He was on the internet one day and noticed a Google ad that said, have you had a hip replacement between 2003 and 2009? Of course he had. Clicked on it only to find his hip implants have been recalled. It's metal on metal, and after a few years of metal on metal rubbing, all of these patients are now walking around with toxic levels of cobalt and chrome ions because those are the content of the hip replacements. We have no idea in this country who got that hip replacement. We can't go into a database and say, oh, Martha had it in 2007 or Ann had it in 2004, because we track nothing. This gentleman is now going for quarterly cardiac investigations, because when you run drug levels that high, you go into cardiac failure and need a transplant. The problem is, if you still have those hip replacements, the transplanted heart goes into failure as well. In the US, the company that makes that device actually pays the health system to remove them. Dave, I don't know, you're the hospital CEO front and center. I don't know if the companies are actually paying for our clinical teams to remove those. And by the way, on this one, there's no protocol that tells us how to remove them without increasing those blood results left. This is not meant to call into fault or blame at all. This is the system we work with. We don't know what patients receive what products in what clinical processes, and we definitely have no line of sight into outcomes in terms of what they're achieving. Is it only hospitals? Sadly, the answer would be no. Canadian Patient Safety Institute did a study of adverse events in community systems. The adverse event rate is almost double what it is in community, and we actually have less reporting and tracking in community settings than we have in our hospital settings. This is a system-wide challenge from primary care right on through to long-term care and end of life. We have no ability to know what products or processes are achieving value for our patients. What's common in all of the safety events we do have reported? They are not well documented. They are essentially invisible. There isn't one clinical organization I have found, and I have looked pretty extensively in 5 countries, that's able to track and trace a product, a process, provider teams to patient outcomes in 5 countries. I spoke to Netherlands last week. The Dutch hospitals will be mandated to do so by 2017. In Canada, I'm hoping that we get there, probably not that quickly. These events are life-changing for families. These deaths, imagine losing a loved one to a medical error that was preventable. Very, very hard to accept. They're common in every country. We do a lot of good work when we have an error. We do a retrospective root cause analysis to understand how do we prevent it from happening again. It's fantastic, but if an error happens in a Calgary hospital, there is absolutely no mechanism for every other hospital in the country to learn from it. Again, because we don't track and trace and share over time. And we've had limited improvement. So what I'm suggesting today is we need to build on the strengths of the work we have done in patient safety in this country. We are one of the most highly educated populations in the world. Our healthcare professionals are sought after worldwide. It's not about the clinician teams. It's about the infrastructure in the environment. When I'm delivering medications to those 8 patients at 8 o'clock in the morning as a nurse, there's an average of 40 to 60 different medications I'm handing out that I scan that ID band for the patient, I scan that medication, and then I instantly get the green light, right medication, dose, time, right patient, or I get the red one that says, no, it didn't scan appropriately, something's wrong, and it proactively lets me know that to prevent the error from happening, not waiting for it to happen, and then figure it out after the fact, which is what we do now. We have much to learn, and many of you in our audience today have much to teach healthcare systems about how to do this. Most other business sectors in the world have already gotten there. In grocery, track and trace every food product. They can tell you what vine the tomato was harvested from that now tells us it's causing E. coli outbreaks in that community. In airlines, every time I go through a gate, they barcode they scan my barcode. You'll see on the monitor, check when you go, a big green check mark. Right passenger, right flight, right gate. They can tell you when I entered that airport, when I checked my bags, and that I'm at the gate on time and what seat I'm sitting in. Retail, they can track every retail item that a customer buys, and if there's a recall, instantly pull it off the shelf. If they recall a head of lettuce for E. coli poisoning, they can pull it off the grocery store shelf. In a hospital, no idea. We don't know which patients might have had a sandwich with that lettuce in it. We have a tremendous amount to learn from our private sector colleagues, and you'll see in some of my recommendations how I'm hoping to capitalize on that phenomenal expertise. Is there anywhere in the healthcare system that tracks and traces products right to patients, or in this case, consumers? Absolutely. Retail pharmacy. They have such incredible, robust systems of tracking and tracing now. They can tell you within 60 minutes what patients purchase what drug that now need to be contacted to pull that drug off the market. They've become the Sentinel surveillance system, both for Walkerton and SARS. It was pharmacy that so quickly saw the patterns in the purchasing behaviors of what their customers were buying to know there was an outbreak of a very serious health event. The catch is when those drugs get distributed to our hospitals in our clinical settings, the tracking stops at the loading dock. We know exactly where the manufacturer produced the drug, what the attributes are, right to that loading dock, and after that, anybody's guess. And that's what I'm looking to try to change in terms of healthcare. What do I mean by a highly visible healthcare system? A system that first and foremost, and this is for the policymakers in the audience, and thank you so much for joining us, adopt global identification standards, which is essentially the numbers in the barcode. If we have a unique identification number on every product in every clinical setting, it's a global business. We can track it anywhere in the world. Every country I've spoken to have shared with me the single most important step in starting down this road of supply chain transformation in healthcare is that one. Adopt global standards. The only one that's global, that transcends not just health products, but those drugs in retail pharmacies and food and grocery stores, is the GS1 barcode. As soon as we do that, it creates the momentum we need. E-commerce, automate all our processes so we never have drug shortages. We don't have product stockouts. As soon as that hip replacement gets inserted into a patient, there's an automatic purchase order that gets generated, and we never actually fail to complete a surgery, which today happens on occasion because we don't have the products we need to complete the process. Tracking and traceability goes without saying. If we know every procedure, every product used in every procedure tied to every patient outcome, it would be the first opportunity our health systems would be used to be able to measure value. How do we know which hip implant, which shoulder repair, which suture material creates the best outcomes? Only until we track it to patient outcomes are we going to be able to do that and create the safety in our clinical environments we desperately need. My mother, she had 3 knee replacements. She only has 2 knees. Why is that? 2 years after the first one, pieces of the plastic in the joint started to break off, pretty painful, and they replaced it. To this day, I cannot tell you what that implant is, and the majority of health systems cannot identify how many people may have had that particular knee surgery. So what's the value proposition? Good business schools always teach our students, create the value proposition. Well, for patients, for sure. Knowing which procedures, which products were used, which knee implant, hip implant, whatever, pacemaker, stent, is fundamental to making good decisions, not only for you personally as a patient, but also those conversations you're going to have with the experts, or if you happen to be traveling, if you happen to have a stent and you land in a hospital in London, England, they don't know what the stent is, they have no idea how to best manage you. Value for clinicians. This oncology surgeon came up to me after I spoke at the Canadian College of Leaders and shared with me, Anne, I got a patient today in hospital for 3 days because I cannot figure out, is this a bare metal stent or is this a drug-eluting stent? And if I don't know, I can't order the magnetic resonance imaging test because a magnet would create a lot of problems if it's got metal in it. Clinicians overwhelmingly identify this as making their quality of life better and their quality of work life much safer. And if you're barcoding everything and it won't scan, It's the alert system or the cue for those clinicians to know, stop right there until you figure out why that is not a successful scan. For healthcare organizations, this is the reason for most health systems, other countries are way ahead of us. For every dollar you invest in supply chain infrastructure, like barcoding and adopting standards, you get an $8 return on that investment. It actually pays for itself, and they haven't yet calculated what savings do we have for all of those errors and adverse events that we're now avoiding. They've only calculated the 8-to-1 return on investment based on the inventory savings, because in healthcare, the other thing we do, and nurses are quite bad for this, we hoard things. If we're always running out of those 3cc syringes, what does a good nurse do? You bury 9 of them in your pockets and make sure you don't run out of them, because it's really hard to work without that equipment. Value for industry. Isn't this going to be challenging for industry? Probably not. What industry wouldn't want to know about those challenges with that pain or those rusting screws to pull them off the market faster? The company that made those implants for the hip patients would far rather settle the lawsuit with 10,000 patients than the current 500,000. Today, industry has no ability, no line of sight to develop the next generation of products based on patient outcomes or segments of patients in terms of the kinds of needs they have. It would actually fuel product innovation compared to what we do now, which is do your best with great R&D, but you never actually see real patient data. So what are some of the solutions I'm proposing? Not shockingly, the very first one is we have to mandate the adoption of global product standards. If we don't do that, we have no global language to identify anything. Products, patients, providers, or care processes. It is the catalyst every other country in the world has found has moved forward very quickly. The second thing, invest in those digital scanning infrastructure. Remember, if you're saving $8 for every dollar you're spending, it actually pays for itself. This is a rare statement for a researcher in a healthcare innovation world to make, because usually innovation is expensive. This one is critically important if we're going to proactively create the alerts clinicians need to make very sure that it's almost impossible to make those errors and to prevent them. The third thing, many countries have established a digital product registry. Why is that? Right now in the US, there are 10,000 joint implants on the market. In Sweden, there are 6. In the UK, there are 100. Why is that? Because Sweden and UK have joint registries. They analyze that data regularly to know that those 6 or those 100 have the best possible outcomes for patients. They're the only ones we're going to use in these clinical settings. We have no such thing. 10,000 different joint implants, you have much less of an ability to do so. Number 4, we need a visibility scorecard. How well is your supply chain in these respective clinical organizations and health systems operating? What value does it achieve? Supply chain and logistics is much of the research business schools have been doing for decades. The problem is they just haven't been doing it in the health sector, because health hasn't always been viewed as a business. Thank you to the support for University of Windsor, however, they see that as very central. And having something to measure your progress against, you cannot manage what you don't measure, and a scorecard helps us get there. Number 5, the next generation of leaders coming out of our business schools and our health disciplines have to understand what is the value and the importance of a strategic supply chain. If you have a measurement scorecard to do that, all that much better, but preparing the next generation of leaders to work with us, engage our private sector colleagues who've been doing this for decades. 30 years ago, they put a barcode on Wrigley's chewing gum. 30 years later, we're still waiting for the barcode on any health product. For me, that's a little bit of a showstopper. And the last thing, which is uniquely Canadian, although I try not to be uniquely Canadian because we share many more challenges than we're different, but we're a small country. We're 2% of the pharmaceutical market. If we don't align our policy frameworks with other countries, particularly our colleagues in the US, we risk not having these next generation and best available products available to us. The more collaboration we're able to achieve with these countries, the better. Those are the patients, and those are the faces I remember all too well in clinical setting. Every one of these Canadians have shared their stories. They've lost loved ones that changed their lives forever. They've had serious harm in loved ones that should never have happened. I'm one of those Canadians. My dad died of a medical error. It wasn't because the clinicians didn't want to do the best for him. It was a terrible loss. I live with it every day, and I don't want even one more family to go through what we've gone through. He never met my children. He was a clinical innovator before innovation was in our everyday language. He's the guy that developed white fillings and tooth bleaching. He would have been over the moon thrilled to see where that's gone today. And the basis of my talk today is really to invite you, to engage you, and to hope that you'll work very closely with us to making sure that never happens again for any one of those families. Thank you so much for coming today, and I look forward to working with each one of you.